Hi, I'm Cheryl Jackson. We know it's important for kids to learn, but did you know their ability to learn depends on their working memory? Working memory is the ability to store and manipulate information in the mind for brief periods of time, and we use it when we're learning new things. It's considered a measure of a child's learning potential, and it's associated with a wide range of academic abilities like literacy and math. Here to help us understand working memory is Lisa Archibald of Western University's School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. She runs a research laboratory called the Language and Working Memory Lab in London, Ontario. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you for coming in. Now, I described it briefly in the intro, but can you give us a better description of what working memory is?
Right. So working memory is that system of working memory that's involved with what you're currently thinking about. So the information you're holding in mind and doing some sort of thinking about. It might be problem solving, it might be reasoning, any of those things we could broadly call the processing of that information that we're doing. And that's the work of working memory. And it's what we're holding currently in mind, not all the things that we know, but what we're currently working on.
Okay, how does it differ from short-term memory? I've heard that word as well.
Right. Well, we're all developing memory all the time. So we begin to lay down memory for things that have happened in our lives, the words that we know about the world, and that information is really in our long-term memory. Mm-hmm. So that is kind of like stores in our long-term memory, and all that information isn't active at any one time, but we can activate it. So someone might say to you, do you remember when we took that vacation last year and we did this? And that kind of activates that memory. So if you were in the library, you could imagine that book gets pulled out and brought onto the top of your desk. And that information on the top of your desk is currently activated. That's your short-term memory. That's the ability to hold that information right there and ready. And that information has to stay activated. So when you say to yourself, oh, I've got to remember to take that with me to work in the morning, or you want to remember an account number while you go across the room, you've got to keep that memory, that information activated in mind. And if you get distracted, if you stop thinking about that kind of information, then it deactivates and you might lose it entirely. So you have to go back over and gather that information again because you've got to reactivate it.
Right.
So that's your short-term memory.
Okay.
Now if you think about that desk having activated information, and you imagine turning on a little desk lamp that would throw a cone of light, and you sat down at that desk and you pulled the most important pieces of information that you needed to into that cone of light, and you started working with that information. So now you're not just keeping it on your desk, but you're transforming it in some way. You're building relationships between it. That would be your working memory. It's the kind of thinking and processing the work you're doing on the information that you're holding in your current focus of attention.
Okay, I think the word that really sticks there for me is processing. Like you're doing something with it, right?
That's right.
It's not
that's
just
right.
sitting there.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you give me an example of how it, so we adults understand it first.
Right.
What is something I might learn that I would need to have working memory for?
Right. So lots of adults can remember what it was like to start to learn to drive a car. So at the beginning, when you're first learning to drive a car, there's lots of things that you have to keep active in your mind. Mm-hmm. You've got to remember to check your mirrors and check your blind spot and follow all those instructions. And that active effort, that thinking effort, your cognitive effort, is really tapping into your working memory. Now, as that skill becomes more and more automatic, then we don't need to hold all that information in mind as much. So our cognitive effort decreases, the amount of tapping of working memory is probably decreasing, and we now are able to not to drive and do other things because it's not consuming our working memory.
So we can say we can drive and not even think about it almost.
Yeah, that's right.
Something like that. I've heard people say that you can hold about 7 things in your mind at once. Is that working memory when I've taken lessons to learn skiing, for instance?
Right.
Is that what we're talking about?
So that's the kind of information that you can hold in mind. That number probably is not accurate but,
right.
But it's referring to that information that you can hold currently in your mind at any one time.
Okay.
And we have lots of ways that we can manipulate that information.
Is there a number then, or is it?
We think that it
really
might be
arbitrary?
closer to more like 4, but that each of those chunks of information can actually be kind of like pyramids of information. So if you tell me 2 or 3 things that I make a connection, and it now becomes like one chunk in my memory.
Like a phone number.
Yeah, then I can maybe remember that where you live and your phone number, and so there's maybe 2 or 3 things that are connected, and then I might have room for another whole chunk of information, even though those chunks are more than one piece.
I see. So is that why it helps when we come up with tricks to remember?
Yes, making those connections
Okay.
supports our working memory. Right. So if I say to you, here's a string of syllables I want you to remember, and I say Davachi Neutag. You've never heard it before, and you've got to work at holding that in mind. But if I say, well, here's a string of syllables I want you to remember, opportunity.
Right.
And I said, well, can you remember that? You say, oh, of course I can remember that. I know that word. I've got lots of support in my long-term memory. I have knowledge about that word. And that word doesn't cost me any energy to hold in mind, or barely any energy. Not like a whole totally new thing that I've never heard before.
All right. I think I understand it a bit better now. How does working memory help kids learn?
Right. So just like the driving example, if you can cast your mind sort of even further back, perhaps, to when to learning to read, or to learn to do math. Those sorts of skills all require a lot of little skills that are put together, right? So if I have to sound out the first sound of a word, then I have to hold that sound in mind while I sound out the next sound in the word, and the next sound. Then I have to remember what the last ones were and put them all together. And so those kinds of tasks really tap that working memory, that ability to hold information in mind. And again, working memory is probably particularly important during the early stages of learning, before those kinds of skills become more and more automatic. So when we get very, very good at reading single words, then that doesn't require as much of our working memory because that becomes more automatic. In school, however, we're always upping the challenge, right? So once a child has mastered something, then we want to increase the challenge so that they have to learn a little bit more. So we're always tapping working memory during these early school years.
Is there enough of a focus on working memory in school?
Well, so when we're focused on the learning of reading and numeracy and those sorts of concepts in school, and we expect children to come in with the cognitive tools that they need to bring to that learning. And so when we're faced with a child who may not have those cognitive abilities develop to the same extent as other children, then we maybe aren't as much focusing on developing those sorts of skills in schools.
All right. How do you know what your child's working memory is?
Right. So working memory, the kinds of times when you notice that working memory is not working, right, is when you're asking children to do tasks in this immediate time frame, right? So I want you to do this, this, and this, right? And then they'll be the kinds of kids who are coming back and saying, well, what was the middle part, or what was at the end? They'll be missing pieces. They'll miss some of instructions because maybe the instructions were longer than they could hold on to. So these would be the kinds of kids who maybe stick out in a classroom at missing these sorts of details.
Why do some kids have, do you call it a lower working memory?
Right.
Why do some kids have lower working memory than others?
So we don't understand this all that well. There's probably some, there's individual variation. So it's simply that some children have better working memory skills than other skills. Probably there is some ability to encourage and help to develop working memory, and we might have some children who have responded to those sorts of tasks a little bit better than others, maybe.
So what can you do then if you think your child has low working memory?
Right. So one thing you can do is maybe help to encourage working memory to develop. So you might have little tasks. So you can imagine sharing a picture book with a child and saying something like, point to the bird, point to the ship, point to the star. And the child has to hold those words in mind and do them in order. And maybe you could increase the number of the items. And you could make that task even a little bit more difficult by maybe engage working memory more if you said, point to the thing that flies, point to the thing that floats, point to the thing that's shining. And now the child not only has to hold those words in mind, but manipulate that information, figure out what you're talking about, and then find the thing. Now, those sorts of tasks will probably encourage working memory. The big question is, can we actually train working memory capacity and enlarge it or improve it or increase it, something like that. And if we can do that, it's probably through quite intensive practice. And so listeners might find out about working memory programs that describe quite intensive programs, quite intensive work. And that, if it's going to change, that's the kind of training that's necessary.
What do you mean by that? How intensive?
Yeah, every day, 40 minutes a day kind of work in a 5-week kind of window. And if we can change capacity, it's going to take that level of work.
So do you think that's within the realm of possibility for most parents?
Some people do engage in that sort of intervention work. Some people plan it out. This is the time in my family life where we're going to do this sort of work, and they'll be able to succeed.
So you were saying this is the way the kids are born. Is this a genetic trait? Is this the way their brains are formed?
Right.
And that's kind of what you have, and you can work on it a bit.
Yes, and again, this is not something we have a really clear answer to. There probably is some relationship, some hereditary relationship, though that's not particularly well studied, I think. But there's this individual variation in the normal population as well, right? And so, as I say, probably there might be some ability to change your working memory, to train it, and there's certainly going to be ways to make your working memory more efficient. So to work with the skills that you have. So that's another way that parents can help their children, is help them to get the necessary skills that are going to make their working memory more efficient. So the same way that I was saying to you before, if a child is working with unknown information, like Davachi Neutag, then that puts much more strain on their working memory, much more effort on their working memory. But if they know lots of words, like they know the word opportunity, then the effort that they have to devote to that part of the task is much reduced. So by developing world knowledge and vocabulary skills and that sort of information, then those will give the child the skills they need to support working memory. And in fact, make the working memory more efficient. So all the lovely things that parents like to do to help their children learn about words in the world and relationships between concepts and what words mean and how they're related to other words are all going to give the child the resources they need to support their working memory, which is then going to make that working memory function more efficiently.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that's something most parents would want to do anyway.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for explaining this to me.
Oh, no problem.
My guest has been Lisa Archibald.